What happens when a woman with too much entitlement and not enough respect tries to decide who belongs in first class? She quickly learns that power isn't about privilege, it's about presence. When Karen, a wealthy and self-important passenger, sees Naomi, a successful black CEO, take a first-class seat, she refuses to accept it. What starts as a condescending remark spirals into a public meltdown that will change Karen's life forever. Humiliation, consequences, and the ultimate fall from grace, all played out at 30,000 feet. But how does it all unravel? And why does the entire internet get involved? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story like this again. Naomi stepped onto the plane with effortless grace, her tailored navy blue suit hugging her frame in all the right places. She walked through the narrow aisle, her Louboutin heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The first-class cabin was pristine, spacious leather seats, ambient lighting, and an unmistakable air of exclusivity. She was about to place her designer handbag in the overhead compartment when she heard it. A condescending chuckle. She turned to see a white woman, mid-50s, meticulously styled blonde bob pearl earrings, and an expression that immediately screamed entitlement. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I think you're looking for economy. First class is up here." Naomi let the words settle for a moment. She had encountered people like this before, the kind who assumed their presence alone set the standard. Instead of reacting, Naomi simply reached into her blazer, pulled out her first-class ticket, and placed it right in front of Karen's smug face. Karen's eyes flicked between the ticket and Naomi, her forced smile tightening. "You must have gotten lucky with an upgrade," she muttered, still unwilling to believe the reality in front of her. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Oh no, I paid for this seat. Just like you did." But Karen wasn't finished. Her face darkened as she looked around, as if searching for an ally. Spotting a flight attendant, she quickly waved her over. "I don't feel comfortable sitting next to her," Karen announced loudly. "She's making me uncomfortable." The flight attendant, a young Latina woman named Sophia, blinked in confusion. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Karen crossed her arms. "I don't think she belongs here. You should check her ticket again. Just to be sure." Naomi exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. Sophia glanced at Naomi, then at the ticket still held firmly in her hand. She took it, examined it, and then, without a shred of hesitation, turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, it looks like you're the one who doesn't belong here," Sophia said smoothly. "Your seat is actually in economy 32E. The color drained from Karen's face. "That's impossible. I booked first class weeks ago." Naomi leaned against the plush leather of her seat, arms crossed. "Well, then it seems there's been a mistake. But you do have a seat on this plane, which is more than enough, right?" The passengers around them had begun to murmur, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Some stifled chuckles. Others openly smirked. Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. Then she scoffed. "I know what this is. You people always get special treatment these days. It's unfair to those of us who actually worked for what we have." The cabin fell silent. Sophia, now visibly irritated, took a deep breath. "Ma'am, I suggest you take your assigned seat before we have to involve security." But Karen had no intention of backing down. If she's really supposed to be here, then who paid for her ticket? Karen spat. "Because I highly doubt," a deep voice cut through the tension. "I did," a man in a tailored suit declared from the row behind them. Every head turned toward him. A distinguished-looking older, white man, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch, and the commanding presence of someone accustomed to power, set down his newspaper. He peered at Karen over his reading glasses. "You might have heard of her. She's Naomi Williams. CEO of Williams Tech. Forbes just featured her as one of the most influential women in business." The gasp that rippled through the cabin was almost audible. Karen's jaw dropped. Naomi smirked. You're joking." Karen stammered, her entire demeanor crumbling. The man folded his newspaper and leaned forward. Not at all. And if you had bothered to do your research before making assumptions, you'd know she could buy this entire plane if she wanted to. Karen's lips quivered. Before she could continue, the PA system crackled to life. Ms. Naomi Williams, please report to the cockpit. The captain would like a word with you. Karen's face lit up with glee. You see, she's in trouble. But Naomi merely smiled. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and turned to Karen with a final glance. You might want to pay attention, she said, her voice honey smooth. You're about to learn what real power looks like. And with that, she strode confidently toward the cockpit, leaving Karen seething in her seat. What awaited her beyond that door? Oh, Karen had no idea. Naomi walked down the aisle with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. The murmurs behind her faded as she approached the cockpit door. The small corridor leading to it was quiet, an odd contrast to the tension she had just left behind in first class. She pressed her palm against the cool metal handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the cockpit was a symphony of glowing instruments and quiet conversations between the flight crew. But Naomi's attention immediately locked onto one figure, the captain. A tall black woman in her late 40s, her navy uniform crisp, her presence commanding. She turned in her seat, her sharp eyes lighting up as she saw Naomi. A slow smile spread across Naomi's face. Captain Williams, she greeted. The captain grinned. Ms. Williams, always a pleasure. The room tensed with the weight of an unspoken truth. Karen, still sitting in first class, had assumed Naomi was being summoned as a reprimand, a consequence for daring to exist where she wasn't supposed to. But Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. Naomi leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I assume you heard the commotion outside? The captain chuckled. It's hard to miss when half the cabin is gossiping about it. Typical, Naomi said, shaking her head. Security wants to remove her, the captain continued. But I wanted to check with you first. You see, this flight is under my command, and I have the authority to make those decisions. Naomi arched a brow. Well, that's convenient. The captain smirked. And given the circumstances, I thought you'd appreciate the chance to witness a first-class escort off the plane. Naomi exhaled in amusement. Tempting. But honestly, I'd rather see her sit there and stew. The captain's expression turned thoughtful. That could be more entertaining. Watching her squirm in discomfort instead of playing the victim when security drags her out. Naomi grinned. Exactly. Then it's settled, the captain said. But just in case, I'll have my team keep an eye on her. Naomi extended a hand. Always a pleasure doing business with you, sis. Captain Williams took Naomi's hand with a firm shake. Karen had assumed Naomi was about to be humiliated. Instead, Naomi had just confirmed her dominance, and not just as a first-class passenger, but as the sister of the captain in charge of the entire flight. Oh, Karen was in for a very long trip. As Naomi exited the cockpit, she found a new energy in her step. When she re-entered first class, all eyes were waiting for her. Karen's smirk had disappeared. Instead, her face flickered between confusion and suppressed glee, as if she was waiting for Naomi to announce her own downfall. Naomi said nothing at first. She walked past Karen without acknowledging her, taking her seat with a composed elegance that only someone truly in control could manage. Karen couldn't stand the silence. So, she finally blurted out, "They let you stay?" Naomi turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Of course," she said smoothly. "The captain just wanted to make sure I was comfortable." Karen frowned. "What do you mean?" A chime rang out through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice echoed over the intercom. "Welcome aboard Flight 217. I'm Captain Williams, and I'll be your pilot today." Karen's entire body stiffened. Her head snapped toward Naomi, her eyes wide with disbelief. Naomi gave her a knowing smile. Karen had assumed Naomi was powerless. But now she realized Naomi's sister was literally flying the plane. The color drained from her face. A man sitting across the aisle chuckled. Damn, that's gotta sting. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Naomi leaned back into her seat, fully relaxed now, as if she hadn't just shattered every false assumption Karen had. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Naomi reached for the champagne glass waiting at her tray table. She lifted it slightly, toasting Karen in mock celebration. Here's to a smooth flight, Naomi said, taking a slow sip. Karen glared daggers at her. Naomi just smiled. Oh, this is going to be fun. The plane began taxiing down the runway, and for the first time since boarding, Karen sat in complete, stunned silence. She had spent the last 10 minutes convinced that Naomi would be humiliated, escorted off the plane, and put back where she belonged. Instead, Naomi was now smirking at her with the confidence of a woman who had just won a battle Karen didn't even realize she was losing. Worse, the pilot, the person in charge of this entire flight, was Naomi's sister. Karen's face burned as the plane gained speed. She wasn't used to being on the losing side of situations like this. She stole a glance around the first-class cabin. Several passengers had witnessed the entire exchange. Some were whispering to one another. Others stole glances at Naomi with newfound admiration. The businessman from earlier, the one who had recognized Naomi from Forbes, caught Karen's eye and shook his head with an amused smirk. It was infuriating. Karen refused to let this be the end of it. As the plane lifted off the ground, she forced a pleasant smile and leaned toward Naomi. I must admit, she said in a voice dripping with artificial politeness, I had no idea you were so well connected. Naomi turned her head slowly, clearly unimpressed. You had no idea about a lot of things. Karen chuckled, ignoring the jab. I suppose we got off on the wrong foot. No hard feelings. Naomi gave her an unreadable look before taking a deliberate sip of champagne. I don't hold grudges, Karen, she said. I just let people embarrass themselves. The businessman across the aisle snorted into his drink. Karen's fake smile tightened. But she wasn't done yet. She needed to regain control of the situation. And if Naomi was going to sit there acting all high and mighty, then Karen would make sure she was brought back down. She turned to a flight attendant passing by and put on her best concerned customer expression. Excuse me, she said sweetly. I hate to be a bother, but I'd like to request a seat change. I don't feel comfortable sitting here. Naomi sighed, already knowing where this was going. The flight attendant, a young woman with dark, curly hair, gave Karen a polite but firm look. I'm sorry, ma'am, but first class is completely booked. Karen's fake smile faltered. Well, surely there's an empty seat in business class, or even economy. The flight attendant hesitated. I can check, but if you move, we won't be able to refund the difference in fare. Karen waved a dismissive hand. That's fine. I'd just rather not sit next to her. She made sure to emphasize the last word just enough to be understood. A few gasps echoed from nearby passengers. The businessman shook his head. Lady, do you ever shut up? Naomi, however, remained perfectly composed. Karen, I thought we were starting over? No hard feelings, right? Karen's mouth opened, but before she could respond, actually, she said cheerfully, I do have an open seat for you, ma'am. Karen perked up. Oh, thank God. Where? The flight attendant pulled out her tablet and tapped a few times. Then she looked up and said without an ounce of hesitation, 32E, economy class. Karen's entire face dropped. Naomi nearly choked on her champagne. The businessman laughed so hard he had to cover his mouth. Oh, now this is just poetic, he said, shaking his head. Karen's expression twisted in horror. You can't be serious. The flight attendant smiled sweetly. Of course. You just said you'd be fine moving to economy. But if she doesn't want that seat, I'll take it. Every head turned toward the back of first class. A tall black man in an elegant suit had stood up. He adjusted his cufflinks with a confident smirk before nodding toward Naomi. "Naomi Williams," he said. "Been a while." Naomi's eyes widened before she grinned. "Marcus Carter. What are the odds?" Karen, now fully panicked, looked between them. "Wait, who's this?" The businessman answered before Naomi could. "Marcus Carter. Billionaire investor. Owns about a dozen luxury hotels. You might have seen his name in Forbes too." Karen's entire body locked up. "I'll trade my seat in economy for hers," he said, nodding at Karen. Karen gasped. "You can't do that." The flight attendant looked at Marcus's ticket, then back at Karen's. "Well," she said, barely hiding her amusement, "since you wanted to switch seats anyway, I don't see a problem." Karen looked like she wanted to scream. "I didn't mean, but it was too late." The businessman from earlier raised his glass. "Enjoy your flight, Karen." Karen had no choice but to stand, her face burning with humiliation. She grabbed her bag and stormed out of first class. Naomi, Marcus, and the other passengers watched as she marched down the aisle all the way to 32E. She was trapped. As Naomi settled comfortably back into her seat, she couldn't resist one final jab. "First class really isn't for everyone," she mused, taking another sip of champagne. Marcus chuckled. "And some people just belong in 32E." The two clinked their glasses together as the plane soared higher into the sky. Karen sank into seat 32E, her arms stiff at her sides as the two passengers beside her, one a sweaty man snacking on a tuna sandwich, the other a mother juggling a crying toddler, ignored her completely. The armrests were already occupied, leaving her with nowhere to rest her elbows. She clenched her fists. This wasn't happening. Just moments ago, she had been sitting in first class, smugly assuming she had the power to dictate who belonged there. Now, thanks to that insufferable woman, she was crammed in economy, sitting next to a man who had just burped loudly into the recycled air of the cabin. A collective gasp came from nearby passengers. Karen screamed, frantically brushing bits of mayonnaise and fish from her expensive skirt. The man blinked. "Oops." The mother beside her snickered as she bounced her still wailing child. Karen's head whipped around toward the aisle, searching for a flight attendant. "Excuse me? I need to be moved back to first class." A different flight attendant, a tall, burly man with a no-nonsense expression, approached her. "Ma'am, I understand you requested this seat change yourself," he said. "Is there a problem?" Karen's eyes twitched. "Yes, there's a problem. My seatmate just spilled food all over me." The man with the sandwich frowned. "Lady, it was an accident. Planes shake sometimes. Ever heard of turbulence?" The mother next to her added, "Welcome to economy, sweetheart." Some nearby passengers chuckled. Karen's face turned scarlet. "Unfortunately, first class is completely booked now. No open seats." Karen nearly choked on her own outrage. "You don't understand. I wasn't supposed to be here in the first place. I need to speak to the captain." The flight attendant sighed. "Captain Williams is flying the plane, ma'am. She's a little busy keeping us in the air." The mention of Captain Williams sent a fresh wave of anger through Karen's veins. "Naomi." It always came back to Naomi. Karen gritted her teeth. She was not going to sit here, humiliated in front of everyone, while Naomi drank champagne in first class, relishing in her downfall. Passengers stared as she marched past row after row, her skirt still stained with tuna. She reached first class and stepped forward with purpose, only to be stopped immediately by Sophia, the flight attendant from earlier. "Ma'am, you can't be up here," Sophia said firmly. Karen's fists clenched. "I need to talk to her." Sophia didn't budge. "First-class access is reserved for first-class passengers, which you are not." A low chuckle came from Naomi's seat. Karen's head snapped toward her, and sure enough, Naomi was watching, glass of champagne in hand, eyes full of amusement. He was laughing. Karen felt something inside her snap. You, she pointed a shaking finger at Naomi. You did this on purpose. Naomi tilted her head. Did what? You humiliated me, Karen shrieked, completely unaware of how ridiculous she sounded. Passengers were watching intently now, some even recording the scene on their phones. Naomi sighed and set down her glass. Karen, you humiliated yourself. The businessman from earlier nodded. Yep, you kinda did. Karen shook with rage. This isn't over. I'll sue this airline. I'll sue you. Good evening, passengers. This is your captain speaking. Just a quick announcement. Disruptive behavior will not be tolerated on this flight. Anyone causing disturbances may be escorted off upon landing. The entire cabin turned back to look at Karen. She froze. Karen stared at him, breathing hard. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Are you refusing the captain's orders? Karen looked around frantically, but there was nowhere left to turn. Defeated, she whirled around and stormed back down the aisle. As she reached 32E, her tuna sandwich seatmate looked up and grinned. Back so soon? The mother chuckled. Guess first class didn't want you either. Karen slumped into her seat, seething. She had lost. Badly. And Naomi? She was sitting in first class, sipping champagne, and enjoying every second of it. Karen sat frozen in 32E, her arms crossed so tightly that her fingers dug into her forearms. She had just suffered the most humiliating moment of her life, being escorted back to economy like a child in trouble at school. The worst part? The entire plane had witnessed it. People in first class had smirked. Passengers in economy had outright laughed. Even the flight attendants had barely hidden their amusement. And Naomi? She was the worst of them all. Karen could still picture her sitting in that plush first-class seat, legs crossed, sipping champagne like a queen watching her rival be dragged out of her own palace. She clenched her fists. This wasn't over. At least, that's what she told herself as she sat, stiff and humiliated, between Mr. Tuna Sandwich and the exhausted mother with the screaming toddler. Naomi let out a satisfied sigh, setting her glass of champagne back on the tray table. Across from her, Marcus Carter, billionaire investor, hotel mogul, and an old friend chuckled as he stirred his whiskey. That, he said, raising his glass, was the most entertaining thing I've seen on a flight in a long time. Naomi smirked. And we haven't even hit cruising altitude yet. Marcus took a sip, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Tell me something. Naomi, did you plan for this to happen, or did the universe just hand you this moment on a silver platter? Naomi leaned back, stretching slightly. I don't need to plan for things like this, Marcus. People like Karen? They do all the work for me. Marcus laughed. True. Entitlement and stupidity are a dangerous combination. Naomi raised her glass in agreement. To self-destruction. Ms. Williams, Captain Williams asked me to send you a bottle compliments of the flight crew. Naomi's smile widened. Well, I certainly won't say no. The flight attendant popped the bottle, pouring Naomi and Marcus fresh glasses before giving Naomi a knowing wink. Naomi lifted her flute, swirling the golden liquid inside. To Karen's first-class experience. Marcus smirked. Or, rather, her economy-class reality. They clinked glasses and took a slow, satisfying sip. Karen was boiling. She could hear the clinking of champagne glasses from first class even over the baby wailing beside her. She could imagine Naomi, lounging comfortably, drinking expensive champagne, celebrating her downfall. Her entire body trembled with rage. Here you go, Ms. Lancaster, she said, placing a small plastic cup in front of Karen. Karen blinked. What's this? Your complimentary drink. The attendant smiled. Apple juice. In a sealed carton. Karen's jaw dropped. Enjoy your flight, the attendant said sweetly before walking away. He leaned down slightly, just enough for only Karen to hear. Didn't want to say this in front of the others, he whispered, but I was going to offer you a way back into first class. Karen's eyes lit up with hope. Really? The businessman nodded solemnly. Yeah, but then I remembered. He straightened, his smirk widening. I just don't like you. Karen's soul left her body. The businessman patted her tray table and strolled back to first class, whistling. Passengers were watching the recordings of her meltdown, whispering, snickering. And then someone uploaded it. Karen's heart stopped. The video was already going viral. She was a meme. Naomi scrolled through her phone, her own notification pinging. She clicked the video. Karen's face filled the screen, mouth open in outrage, her voice rising in indignation, her expression crumbling when she was ordered back to economy. Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. Marcus leaned over. What's so funny? Naomi turned the phone so he could see. Marcus took one look and let out a deep, satisfied laugh. You know, he mused, I wouldn't be surprised if she tries to sue the airline for emotional distress after this. Naomi smirked. Let her. It won't change the fact that she got exactly what she deserved. Marcus clinked his glass against hers once more. A toast to victory, he said. Naomi smiled, taking one last sip of champagne as the plane soared higher, leaving Karen Lancaster's dignity far, far below. Karen sat rigid in 32E, her fingers curled so tightly around the tray table that her knuckles had turned white. The quiet hum of the airplane did little to mask the whispers and snickers from the passengers around her. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting for her next outburst. But what truly sent her spiraling into panic was the notification flashing on screen after screen. First class Karen gets sent to economy. The title alone made her blood boil. Someone had recorded her meltdown. And now it was spreading across the internet at the speed of pure humiliation. She turned to the businessman beside her, Mr. Tuna Sandwich, and snapped. Are you seriously watching that video right next to me? The man barely looked up, popping another bite of his sandwich into his mouth. Lady, if you didn't want to go viral, maybe don't act like a lunatic on a plane. Karen's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't the only one watching. Across the aisle, the young woman with wireless earbuds had the video paused on Karen's frozen, horrified face. A teenager 2 rows ahead giggled as he replayed the moment Karen had stomped up the aisle only to be rejected from first class. The mother with the crying toddler? Even she was shaking her head in amusement. Karen gritted her teeth so hard it hurt. Naomi scrolled through the comments section of the now viral video, barely hiding her amusement. Marcus leaned over. Any good ones? Naomi smirked and read aloud. Lady tried to go full villain, but forgot she had zero power. Captain Williams said, not on my plane. Economy class exile. Justice served at 32E. Marcus burst into laughter, shaking his head. The internet wastes no time. Naomi took another sip of her champagne. Oh, this is only the beginning. Karen's phone pinged. She glanced down, her stomach twisting. Her inbox was flooded. At first, she thought maybe my friends are supporting me. Maybe someone had defended her against this public embarrassment. But then she opened the messages. OMG, Karen, is this you? Girl, what were you thinking? Lol, you just got roasted by the entire internet. Her chest tightened. From HR department subject. Urgent discussion needed. Karen stared at the subject line, her mouth suddenly dry. Urgent discussion. That was never good. Her job, her career. She had worked for years to build up a reputation of class, dignity, and power, and now she was a walking joke. Ma'am, the attendant said politely, the captain has requested that you remain seated for the rest of the flight, for security reasons. Karen's face drained of color. You think I'm a security threat? She gasped. The flight attendant gave a neutral smile. No, ma. But since this flight is being monitored closely now, we just want to ensure everyone remains comfortable. She had officially been flagged. Her breath came in short, shaky gasps. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had boarded this plane believing she was better than everyone else, that she had a right to decide who belonged in first class. And now, she was the one being watched. The flight attendant left, and Karen sat completely still. Her mind raced. She needed damage control. Maybe she could say she was set up, that the airline had disrespected her, that Naomi had manipulated the situation. Yes, that could work. She quickly opened Twitter and started typing. Karen's fingers hovered over the screen. No, she wouldn't. She clicked the tweet. And there it was. A simple, devastating response from Naomi. When entitlement meets consequences. 32E. The tweet had thousands of likes and retweets. Karen's entire body locked up. People were laughing at her. Not just on the plane, not just in the airport, but across the entire internet. Naomi locked her phone and smiled at Marcus. Checkmate, she said simply. Marcus chuckled, raising his glass. I'd say that's game over. Naomi took one last, slow sip of champagne, savoring the moment. Karen had wanted to prove she belonged in first class. Instead, she had just proven to the world exactly where she belonged. Karen sat frozen in 32E, her pulse hammering in her ears. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her, suffocating, inescapable. She had come onto this flight believing she was superior, that first class was her rightful place. But now she was a viral joke, her name splashed across the internet, mocked by thousands, maybe even millions of people. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She had muted notifications, but they still poured in relentlessly. Text messages from coworkers, emails from HR, and the worst of them all, from Michael Dawson, VP of Corporate Affairs. Subject: urgent meeting upon landing. Karen swallowed hard. This was bad. HR emails were one thing, but when the vice president was personally reaching out, it meant her job was on the line. She quickly typed out a response. There's been a misunderstanding. The airline mistreated me, and someone filmed it to make me look bad. She hovered over the send button. Was this convincing? Would it work? Before she could overthink it, she hit send. Then she opened Twitter, searching desperately for any support in the comments. Nothing. Not a single person was on her side. The top comment under Naomi's viral tweet, 32E, is the new walk of shame. Karen's stomach churned. How had this gone so horribly wrong? Naomi stretched her legs out, feeling completely at ease. Marcus scrolled through his phone, still grinning. You really set the internet on fire with that tweet. Naomi smirked. I wasn't even trying. People just love watching karma in action. A notification popped up on her phone, an email from one of her assistants. Her brand was trending. She hadn't planned for this, but she certainly wasn't complaining. Marcus lifted his glass. To making the world a slightly better place, one exposed Karen at a time. Naomi laughed, clinking glasses. Karen was drowning in panic. She had one last move, one last chance to turn this around. She hit the call button. A flight attendant appeared. Yes, ma'am? Karen forced a polite smile. I need to speak to the captain. The attendant blinked. Captain Williams? Yes. It's urgent. The attendant hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. As she walked away, Karen sat up straighter, rehearsing her words. If she could plead her case, if she could convince the captain that this was all a misunderstanding, maybe, just maybe, she could salvage. Tis disaster. She waited. And waited. And then, instead of Captain Williams, she was accompanied by a security officer. Karen's blood ran cold. Ms. Lancaster, the officer said in a professional yet firm tone, the captain has been informed of your request. Karen nodded rapidly, relief flooding her. Great, but given the disruption you've already caused, the officer continued, she has denied your request and has instead instructed me to inform you that upon landing, security will be escorting you for further discussion with airport authorities. Her mouth went dry. Escort me? Yes, ma'am, the officer said. to discuss your behavior on this flight." The businessman across the aisle chuckled to himself. The woman with the toddler whispered, "Oh my God." Karen could feel the eyes on her. The plane began its descent, and Naomi relaxed into her seat. Marcus glanced at her. "So, what's next for you? After this entertaining flight?" Naomi smiled. "Back to business. Deals to close, partnerships to build." Marcus nodded. "And Karen?" Naomi chuckled. "Karen has a long day ahead of her." The landing gear engaged, the familiar sensation of descent pressing them slightly into their seats. Minutes later, the plane touched down. Smoothly, the engines roaring to a gradual stop as they rolled toward the terminal. "Ms. Lancaster." Karen's entire body stiffened. Every single passenger turned to watch. Naomi and Marcus exchanged glances, both holding back grins. Karen slowly stood, humiliation washing over her in waves. The businessman called after her, "Safe travels, Karen." A few snickers followed. Karen bit her lip, her face burning. She was escorted off the plane not as a first-class passenger, not as someone important, but as someone who had just learned the hard way that entitlement had consequences. Naomi stood, gathering her things. Marcus chuckled. "Guess it's true what they say." Naomi raised a brow. "What's that?" Marcus smirked. "Some people just belong in 32E. Karen barely heard the voices around her as she was escorted off the plane, her mind racing with one desperate thought: how do I fix this? Passengers whispered as she passed, their eyes filled with curiosity, amusement, and barely concealed mockery. She had come onto this flight thinking she owned the world, that she could dictate who belonged in first class. Now she was the woman being led out by security, not as a VIP, but as a disgraced fool. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air hitting her skin, she forced herself to take deep breaths. The security officers didn't stop at the gate. They walked her through the terminal, side by side, their presence unmistakable. Karen's stomach dropped as she realized people were watching. Travelers moved through the airport, dragging luggage, sipping overpriced coffee and staring. A few held phones up, clearly recording. Breaking. 32E Karen just got escorted off the plane. Karen wanted to scream, but she couldn't. Not here. Not when every step she took was being broadcast to the world. She gritted her teeth, keeping her head down, hoping, praying that this nightmare would end. Naomi adjusted her sunglasses as she strolled off the plane, Marcus at her side. "Think she's still spiraling?" he asked casually. Naomi smirked. "Oh, definitely." Marcus glanced at the terminal. "And judging by those cameras, she's about to go viral again." Naomi shook her head in amusement. She wasn't someone who sought revenge. She didn't need to. People like Karen? They exposed themselves, and the world took care of the rest. Karen was led to an area near the security office. A uniformed airport official stood waiting, his face unreadable. "Ms. Lancaster," he said, his tone neutral but firm. Karen lifted her chin. "This is a mistake. I am a loyal customer of this airline. I demand to speak to someone in charge." The officer raised a brow. "Ma'am, the person in charge of your flight was Captain Williams, and she's the one who flagged you for disruptive behavior." Karen's breath caught. That name again. Williams. Naomi's sister. This entire disaster had been a setup, hadn't it? The officer continued. "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct. After reviewing the reports and security footage, the airline has decided to issue a formal warning." Karen blinked. "A warning?" The officer nodded. "And a temporary ban from flying with us." Her heart plummeted. No, you can't do this. I have important trips planned. I am a valued." The officer held up a document. "Ma'am, this is official. Your frequent flyer account is suspended, and any first-class privileges are revoked indefinitely." Karen snatched the paper, scanning it frantically. It was real. She wasn't just banned from first class. She was banned from the airline itself. Her entire travel status gone. Her face burned as she realized something even worse. Her legs felt weak. This wasn't just a bad day anymore. This was career-destroying. Just as she tried to compose herself, a loud burst of laughter echoed through the terminal. Karen's stomach sank. She turned her head slowly. Marcus grinned. Well, looks like 32E is your new permanent home. Karen's eyes filled with rage. Naomi tilted her head, completely composed. Karen, she said smoothly, I hope this experience has been educational for you. Karen's breath shuddered. You ruined me, she spat. Naomi raised an eyebrow. No, Karen. You ruined yourself. Karen felt her entire world closing in. Naomi took a slow, deliberate step forward. You thought you could humiliate me, she said. You thought you had power over me. She leaned in slightly, just enough for Karen to feel the full weight of her words. But the truth is, Karen, you never even had control over yourself. Karen's hands shook. Naomi smiled. Enjoy your future wherever you end up sitting next. With that, she turned, walking away with Marcus at her side. Karen stood there, shaking, her entire life crashing down around her. She had tried to push Naomi down, but in the end, she was the one who fell the hardest. Karen stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, clutching the airline's official notice in her trembling hands. Her frequent flyer account was suspended. She was banned from first class. And worse, her entire career was now at risk. The security officers had left her alone, their job done. But Karen felt anything but free. Passengers passed by, some still recording, some whispering, others outright laughing. She felt naked, exposed. For years, she had crafted a meticulously curated image of power, status, and influence. Now, she was just a viral joke. Her phone vibrated again, another message from her boss. From Michael Dawson, VP of Corporate Affairs. Subject: temporary leave pending review. Karen's stomach lurched as she read the email. Given the current public attention surrounding your behavior, the company has decided to place you on a temporary leave of absence pending an internal review. Please be prepared to discuss the situation in a formal meeting. Temporary leave. A corporate death sentence. Her fingers tightened around her phone. If they were reviewing her now, it meant they were already considering cutting her loose. This wasn't just about the airline anymore. This was about her entire career. Naomi and Marcus stepped into a waiting black luxury car, the driver holding the door open for them. Marcus checked his phone, still amused. The video's over 2 million views now. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Already? Marcus smirked. Turns out, people love watching karma in real time. Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. Some lessons just teach themselves. The car pulled away from the terminal, leaving Karen behind, and for Naomi, this chapter was closed. Karen paced back and forth inside the terminal, her mind spinning. She had to fix this. Her job, her reputation, her entire future. She quickly opened Twitter, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The truth about Flight 217, I was mistreated, and the airline unfairly punished me. This is a clear case of discrimination, and I will not be silenced. Hashtag justice for Karen. She hit send, breathing heavily. Maybe, just maybe, she could flip the narrative. The tweet took off immediately, but not how Karen had hoped. Comments flooded in within minutes. Oh, sweetie, no. This isn't discrimination. This is consequences. LOL. She's really trying to play the victim after all that. Girl, you dug your own grave. Now lie in it. Hashtag 32E. Karen's vision blurred with frustration. As Karen frantically scrolled through the backlash, her worst nightmare came true. A major news outlet picked up the story. Corporate executive removed from first class after viral meltdown. Internet reacts. Karen stopped breathing. It was everywhere now. Not just social media. Not just gossip. But actual news. And her company would see every word. Karen saw the caller ID. Her boss. Her hands shook as she answered. Karen. Michael Dawson's voice was icy, controlled. Karen swallowed. Michael, I can explain. No need, he cut in. We've seen enough. Karen's heart pounded. I'm sorry, he continued, but we can't have someone representing our company like this. We'll be terminating your position, effective immediately. Just like that. No second chances. No recovery. Karen tried to speak, but nothing came out. She had lost everything. Her status, her reputation, her job. And all because she had refused to believe that Naomi belonged in first class. Karen sat in the terminal for hours, staring at nothing, her mind blank. By the time she finally dragged herself to the exit, she looked around, half expecting a luxury car to be waiting for her. It arrived, an old Toyota Corolla, barely clean. She swallowed her pride, slid into the back seat, and as the car pulled away from the airport, she finally accepted reality. This wasn't a bad day. This was her new life. Naomi sat in her penthouse office, sipping coffee, scrolling past another article about the flight. Marcus sent her a text. Karen just got fired. Guess that's checkmate for real. Naomi smiled, but she wasn't gloating. She hadn't needed revenge. She had just stood her ground. And in the end, Karen had destroyed herself. Naomi locked her phone and leaned back. Time to move on. Some people just weren't worth her time. Karen sat motionless in the back of the old Toyota Corolla, her hands gripping her phone as if holding onto the last fragments of her once perfect life. Just hours ago, she had been a respected corporate executive, a woman of status and privilege. Now, she was unemployed, disgraced, humiliated. Her company had cut ties immediately, unwilling to let her viral meltdown stain their reputation. Her frequent flyer account gone, her first-class status revoked indefinitely. And worst of all, she had become a global joke. She scrolled through Twitter, her face burning as thousands of comments flooded her notifications. Karen went from first class to no class really quick. Imagine losing your job over a seat. Just sit down and shut up next time, lady. Naomi Williams didn't even have to destroy her. Karen did it all by herself. 32E. Karen threw her phone onto the seat beside her, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She had lost everything. And for what? Because she had refused to accept that a black woman could sit beside her in first class? Had she really been so blinded by entitlement that she'd destroyed her own life over a plain seat? The realization hit her. Like a truck, her breath shuddered as she leaned her head against the car window, watching the city blur past. She had spent years believing she was better than others, that her wealth, her privilege, her status made her superior. But none of that mattered now. Now she was just another nobody. And the worst part? The world had already moved on without her. Naomi stepped into her New York office, her assistant already waiting with an itinerary for the week. Ms. Williams, the assistant said, your stock value has increased since the viral video. Investors see this as a power move. The board wants to meet this afternoon to discuss expansion opportunities. Naomi smiled, taking the folder. Good, she said smoothly. She had expected some attention after the incident, but she hadn't expected it to turn into a business advantage. She wasn't just being seen as a CEO anymore, she was being seen as a force. She checked her phone. They wanted to talk about the flight, about Karen, about how Naomi had handled it with power and grace. Naomi smirked. This wasn't just her win. This was a lesson for Karen, for people like her, and for anyone who still believed they could dictate who deserved success. She typed a response. Let's set it up. It's time for the world to see what real power looks like. Karen sat in her tiny one-bedroom apartment, staring at her laptop. Her inbox was filled with rejection emails. No one wanted to hire someone who had become a walking PR disaster. She had called old friends, old connections, hoping someone would help her. But one by one, they had distanced themselves. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, But in the end, she had burned every bridge. Her hands shook as she refreshed her bank account. Her savings wouldn't last forever. And she had no backup plan. She had always thought she was untouchable, that her money, her influence, her privilege would protect her from consequences. But she had learned the hard way no one is untouchable. Karen turned on the news, and there it was Naomi Williams, sitting in a luxurious studio, poised and confident. The interviewer asked, "How did it feel watching someone like Karen try to undermine you?" Naomi gave a small, knowing smile. "Honestly," she said, "I didn't have to do anything. Some people just expose themselves." Karen closed her laptop. She had no defense. No more excuses. Just silence. For the first time in her life, she finally saw herself clearly. And she didn't like what she saw. Some people believe that power comes from status, wealth, or privilege. But real power? It comes from integrity, respect, and knowing your worth. Karen learned that the hard way, but by the time she realized her mistake, it was already too late. What do you think? Did she deserve what happened, or do you think it went too far? Let us know in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. See you in the next one.